Like, I forget what kind of car that is, but back in Eritrea, my family was like, yeah, I was going somewhere and I remember hearing that song in the car and all that touched me. So political music, I'm guessing, there's so many different ways. You can hear it on the radio, because there's like a radio station in Alsmara at the time that you would hear a lot of this music. I don't know about performing spaces. I'm not 100% familiar with like the venues that would be available to musicians. I'm sure there's like different venues for that. But if it came to like the work of the cultural troops, it'd be like on the battlefield or like in the field in the countryside. But that's something that I could definitely explore more in the future for sure.
Yeah, thank you. That's really interesting.
My friend over here had for Lily the question of that often, obviously, colonial powers seek to crush any original, languages, so as to keep any subversion or like resistance from happening. But the British didn't seem bothered by that. Did that bite them in the butt at all? Was there any subversion or anything like that you have encountered in your research?
In complete honesty, this presentation is very far out of what I normally research. It's in a different state from what I normally research. So I can't speak to that. That is not something I research. And I was more interested in urban geography and social geography, not necessarily larger connotations of social revolution. But it is something I would be very interested in learning myself, given given that language and language geography is another thing I'm very interested in that I have no time to research.
Yeah, fair.
So.
This is a question for Naomi. I was just wondering if there was anything else that you wanted to expand upon a bit in regard to how the economic institutions or situations of the past affect the current economic institutions of today.
Thank you for that question. I think it's very packed, and there's a lot to unpack there, you know what I'm saying? Because truly, even though African countries have gained political freedom, there is no political or true freedom, sovereignty, without economic freedom. And there's a lot of people that understand this in Africa, and it's very difficult to tackle because capitalism, the way that institutions operate today, are the same way that they operated during European imperialism. And it's very difficult to undo these kinds of institutions or try to reroute them to make them more fair, right? And there are a plethora of speakers like PLO Lumumba of Kenya or Julius Malema of South Africa who are trying to tackle these issues within their respective countries, but understand that this is a greater African issue that we need to come together about and try to tackle, because it's not one country that faces this issue. It's almost every single African country, and if we come together, there's there's better outcomes that can happen as a result of that. So thank you for that. Yes.
Yeah, I had a question. I just want to, my seat here, take it a little further and talk about futurity for everyone. Prescriptive. You're doing a beautiful job and thinking about the knowledge and information you delivered today. And I'm also thinking about Garvey, who said Africa for Africans, and the Chinese fusion, cobalt in phones. How do you envision, for each of you, multilingual, how do you envision the future with what you've just learned in that sense? And the future can be immediate, long-term, however you're construing it.
I think that's a very good question. The road to economic sovereignty for Africa is going to be a difficult one to achieve in its totality. And I think it starts with, honestly, I think the diaspora need to help a lot, because Nkrumah noted in one of his books that if Africans are able to harness the coin of of areas that have imperialized Africa, especially the United States. So if we harness the US dollar, if we harness the euro, and if we're influential within our respective countries that are not within Africa, because Africa's already been exploited. Our dollar or our currency values are just simply don't really exist. It's like totally inflated. There's not much value in our currency. So if we're able to harness outside currency, similar to what China has done, then we can influence Africa, invest into industries. Instead of being the laborers, we can be the manufacturers and laborers. We can totally try to do things in-house and uplift our own economies.
Yeah, and as far as where my research was focusing on urban geography, social geography, and language, I love maps. So like I've taken geography classes where they show you maps, and it reflect, and country size on this map is reflected by population size or largest city, or urban density. And I think we're already starting to see that population shift being away from Europe and North America. And we've been seeing this for the last 70 plus years. And I think so if we continue to see this sort of shifting in urban power and coupled with this economic security and independence, I think we'll also see eventually, I hope, a development of broader interdisciplinary studies programs, broader linguistic programs, where you could conceivably get a degree here in the States in West African languages, or even if you could get into region specific, like South African languages, Eritrean languages, for instance. If we could start seeing that sort of development and start seeing more of a shift away from English as the language business, as a lingua franca, where again we're seeing that with Spanish, with Arabic, and with Chinese in our current economic situation. If we can start seeing with a shift in African economic stability and security and independence, we might also start to see this linguistic shift.
Sure, that was a really good question. I had to think
Yeah.
No,
saying.
I'm always thinking about that.
Sure.
Solutions, praxis.
Absolutely. So I guess one of the first thoughts I had is, Ethiopia and Eritrea have had a long history of interconnection in our cultures. And, if I'm out in public, if I see someone Ethiopian, we'll greet each other, like, hey, I think there's not as much tension between young diaspora members than maybe people back home. But I guess I would say, Ethiopia is one of the most populous countries in Africa. I think it's number 2, right? But in African studies, it is like completely neglected. We don't really talk about it because, the focus on West Africa and the centralism of West Africa in music curriculum and, history. So I would say, I guess for the future to, broaden the definition of what we consider African, because when we say African, we generally think of West African or whatever the media has taught us, Disney, all those things, right? Don't get me started on that. But so I would say, including more of East Africa and other parts of Africa in scholarship. And I'd also say I'm very interested in diaspora communities. I think you mentioned a little bit about that. Especially post the war and like the everything going on in East Africa, there was a big migration, especially of Eritrean immigrants to other places, like forming diaspora communities in North America and Europe, all over the world. You can find them, and I think it's so interesting to see how they have acclimated to their new environments. And I think it would be amazing to do community organizing, education for these young people who may or may not have a knowledge of, what it is like, what their history and their culture is, and that's something I would love to do as an educator. I guess my last thought is, music is such a unifying force in any kind of political movement, in any kind of setting. If people are singing together and making music, they're generally not fighting one another, generally. And I would say, especially with like the current conflict going on in East Africa, there's a lot of instability and political turmoil. I would say if people could unite around music or what connects them instead of divides them, that could be a very healing force for a very tense political situation that's happening right now.
Thank you.
Any other?
Just since you mentioned it, is there any curriculum on like you mentioned, systematic study on West African music? Obviously there needs to be more on East African, but is there even any on West African music?
Oh, there's plenty.
Okay.
I mean, I went through music school, like a kind of a conservatory setting, so most of my education was like Western classical, but there's definitely studies and there's definitely textbooks about West African culture and music, and there's plenty of it, and I love it all. I'm not saying anything bad about, you know, that's just how the curriculum is kind of set up. I'm trying to think about what else I can say, so I guess yes.
Any final questions?
I think I have a question. So during the, I have a question. So like, when Eritrea was gaining independence, how were the populations that were like divided, like in the Tigray region, affected by that? Because I know there's like one in Ethiopia and one in Eritrea. How were they affected by that? Families being split. What was that like on the ground?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I know at least post 1991, there is a lot of conflict over the border because of like, you know, where the lines were drawn. I don't think I'm familiar enough with events during the war period because access to Eritrean history documents is kind of far and few in between. If you don't have access to what is written going back to like East Africa, it's a little more difficult, and from what I did see, those studies didn't really focus on the Tigray people, but I know there's a lot of displacement and a lot of contested, like that border being contested. Yeah, borders are very, very hotly contested whenever it comes to partitioning or drawing lines, and even today that's still an issue.
Yeah. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. I think you guys have 20 minutes until the next panel.
Great job.